The night the river took my house, my own daughter shut the door in my face. At 2:14 a.m., my phone lit up. Emergency alert, immediate evacuation. I was barefoot in the kitchen. The kettle had just begun to sing. In 20 minutes, the water crossed my threshold, swallowed my keys, and climbed the legs of the table where I'd paid bills for 20 years. I grabbed one folder, my mother's sewing tin, and the blue kettle that still smelled like home. I drove straight to my daughter's street because she had said, "Come here." Her neighborhood was dry, smug, and untouched. I carried 3 bags and that kettle to her door. She opened it just enough for the hallway light to slice between us and said, "Mom, we decided this won't work. Try a hotel. No anger, no room, just a decision already signed." That was the moment the flood changed names. Water had taken my house. That sentence tried to take my place in it. I nodded, because sometimes silence is the only coat that fits. If you've ever felt the floor disappear under your feet while someone you love stayed framed in the doorway, stay with me until the end. Then tell me which city you're listening from. I want to know where this kind of night finds you. That night I slept in my car, not from bravery, but because rooms after midnight cost more than I had. I parked under a light in the grocery lot, folded my coat over the steering wheel, and tried not to think about how quickly a mother can become luggage. By morning, a gas station mirror showed a face that had missed a night and a life. I bought cheap coffee to make standing legal and didn't dare look twice. At 10:22, my phone buzzed again. Claim update, total loss. Depreciation, deductible, 30 to 45 days. Numbers marched in a straight line toward a place I couldn't live. In less than 12 hours, I had lost a roof, a couch, a kitchen drawer full of takeout menus, and the illusion that my daughter's front door would always be my emergency exit. That evening, I tried a church parking lot. A man in a yellow cap tapped my window. "You lost?" he asked. "Just tired," I said. "Aren't we all?" he answered, and left me the quiet that follows a kind truth. I tilted the seat back and kept my hands on my stomach like I was holding myself in. I told myself not to think about old promises. I keep names I swore I'd forget in the same drawer as spare keys. But the body remembers before the brain obeys. On the 3rd morning, I pried open my mother's green tin, looking for anything that felt like a direction. Beneath buttons and a coil of elastic lay a small brass key with a violin-shaped bow and a storage receipt in my younger handwriting. Under that, a softened business card, a first name in faded blue, a number with an area code I hadn't dialed in years. My hands went steady the way hands do when they remember having a purpose. I called. It rang twice. "This is Miguel," the voice said. Older timber, same ground. I told him about 214, about the sirens, about try a hotel, about the car that had become a room. There was a pause, the kind that measures you. "Text me where you are," he said. I started to argue. He said my name once, like a rope thrown clean. "Come with me." He found me by the sound a good engine makes. He didn't inventory my shame or make a list of my mistakes. He lifted the kettle like it mattered. We drove to the storage place, a row of sun-faded doors, each with a dent that proved a life had happened there. The key turned as if metal could remember metal. The door rolled up with a reluctant sigh. Inside waited a trunk with a brave leather handle, one box labeled kitchen in a hopeful curve, and a manila envelope that had outlived its glue. The trunk held a quilt stitched from dresses I no longer fit, a cigar box with 3 coins and a Polaroid full of bad haircuts, and a notarized letter that read like permission: take possession and maintain until transfer or sale. Taxes paid through a year that wasn't yesterday. A door that wasn't pretty, but it opened. The wardrobe box offered mercy disguised as ordinary. A winter coat that remembered my shoulders, boots that wanted work, 2 plates, a saucepan with a dent you could trust, a wooden spoon with a burn mark like a map. We stacked what mattered now and what would matter next week. The kettle, of course, the folder and the letter, the coat, the blanket, the saucepan, the spoon, 2 books that can be reread without apology. I tied the letters back with their tired ribbon. Some floodlines you choose yourself. Miguel unfolded the letter on the hood of his truck and read the legal paragraphs out loud, the way some men read weather. "This cabin's still yours," he said finally, "if you want it." The word cabin hung in the air like a bridge I hadn't known was there. The place sat 2 hours up a road that remembered curves, cedar shingles silvered by weather, a porch with 1 missing baluster, a door still politely green beneath the blisters. The lock turned. The room smelled like dust and old rain. We opened the shutters and the light didn't hesitate. It walked right in as if I had been expected. The well cap was where the note said it was. The propane valve argued and then cooperated. The breaker clicked up and the old refrigerator answered like a friend who still picks up. I swept while Miguel read the roof from the ground. The house didn't promise more than it could keep. That felt like respect. We ate bread, an apple that had waited too long, and tuna that tasted better than the label suggested. Sorrow makes even plain food honest. I'm angry, I said at last. Not at water. Water doesn't choose. At that sentence at the door. At being this age and learning which thresholds only open one way. You still measure, he said. That's a skill. We slept on folded blankets and history. Night in the trees spoke in a tongue that didn't need witnesses. I woke 3 times reaching for a car ceiling and found beams that knew their maker. Morning came like a reasonable employer. On time, ready to work. The first boil in a new place tastes like the decision that preceded it. The kettle sang. Steam found my face. Something inside me exhaled for the first time since the siren. Miguel left that afternoon and came back with a mattress, a tall broom for roof needles, 2 lamps that minded their business. He set hinges right. I washed the floor. By evening, the cabin had crossed from structure to shelter, from somewhere to land for now to somewhere that might dare call me back. Days began to settle into a shape I could hold. Sweep, fix, phone calls, rest. I called my daughter from the one spot in the yard where the signal understood hills. I told her I was safe and had a place with paper to back it. Relief attached itself to the task the way it always had with her. Let me bring groceries, she said, already halfway to forgiveness through lists. Saturday, she came with milk, rice, soap, and a brand I probably wouldn't have chosen. We laughed about the roof's potential leak, which is another way to say we were both hopeful and cautious. We made tea. She looked at the blue kettle and her face softened. I'm sorry about that night, she said at last. It was late. It was, I agreed. The apology didn't erase the doorway, but it loosened its grip. The insurance company followed with lists. Covered, not covered, sentimental, therefore irrelevant. If you can't price it, it's probably the part that kept you alive. 2 of Miguel's men came on a favor and turned the missing baluster into a bench. By evening, the door hung true, the roof breathed easier, and I could put a list on the table without it sliding off. At the top I wrote, keep the door open while it's safe. Lock it when you sleep. Finish the part you can finish. The county office said I could reactivate utilities if I proved occupancy and safety. Words that sound simple until they lean on you. I made copies of the notarized letter and storage receipt, took a photo of the meter with that day's date on a slip of paper, and even snapped a selfie on the porch because sometimes you have to put your own face in the evidence. I thought the paperwork would be the hardest part. I was wrong. 2 mornings later, a man in a crisp shirt knocked, his truck door advertising a development company with a name meant to sound gentle. He carried a clipboard and the kind of smile that wants to buy what isn't for sale. The county, he said, planned to reassess holdings near the ridge. Had I considered relocation support? I told him I had just relocated from a flooded house to a cabin whose roof had decided to be kind. He looked past me like roofs were gossip and left a brochure anyway. When his tires rattled away, the quiet felt like a held breath. Miguel arrived with a box of screws and a look that read the driveway like a page. I told him about the man and the words, reassess holdings. He nodded the way builders do when they meet a problem they can measure. They've been sniffing around up here, he said. If anyone claims right of way across your steps, we'll answer with paper, not heat. He pulled a folded survey from his glove compartment and showed me orange tape still clinging to brush where lines had been walked last fall. You won't stand alone in a room, he said. Not for something that has your name on it. The county inspector came next with a notebook and a careful voice. She checked the porch, the stove clearance, the breakers. You've done this right, she said. I just need proof you're repairing, not expanding. The ridge lots are a tangle. I handed her the notarized letter. She read the stamp, then my name, then the date, and nodded. This is cleaner than most. She signed her part and left me with a yellow tag I hung on a nail like a medal. Larissa texted that she would come again, this time alone and earlier. She arrived with paint samples and a bag of groceries that had remembered blueberries. We sanded the porch rail and talked about ordinary things until the ordinary felt like an achievement. I told her about the man with the clipboard. She went very quiet. Diogo knows that firm, she said. They're trying to bundle parcels for a trailhead. He thinks it'll raise values. She watched my face. Do you want me to ask him to leave this alone? I want you to want me to stay, I said, and immediately wished I'd chosen something softer. She didn't flinch. I want you to stay, she answered. Then smaller. I also wanted to sleep that night. We both stood there with 2 trues in our hands and no decent pocket to put them in. We painted anyway. By the time the sun turned gold, the rail had a new skin, and our silence had learned a kinder shape. I thought the next hurdle would wait for business hours. It didn't. The development company posted a notice at the roadhead, an invitation to a public meeting, to discuss community access and safety improvements. I read it twice and heard the words that weren't printed. Access often means taking the shortest path through the place that is yours. Safety often means smoothing what was never meant to be smooth. I folded the flyer and slid it under the kettle like a promise. On the day of the meeting, I wore the winter coat that remembered my shoulders and carried a canvas bag with what my mother would have called receipts. The notarized letter, the storage contract, the yellow tag, and 4 photos with their times stamped in the corner. Miguel met me in the lot and handed me a thermos. Inside, the room hummed with the heat of people who like microphones. A map stood on an easel at the front, parcel lines drawn in candy colors that swallowed ridges and creeks like they were ideas, not places. The company man spoke first about connectivity, amenities, emergency response times. He used a phrase I have learned to mistrust. For everyone. He gestured with a capped marker at a dotted line that cut across land he called underutilized. The dotted line ran straight through my porch. They opened the floor. A neighbor in a camo jacket said trails were fine as long as trucks could still get through in winter. A mother with a baby on her shoulder asked for parking that wouldn't choke the 1-lane road. Then I stood, and every tired part of me stood with me. I'm not against paths, I said. I am against the idea that my home is the shortest distance between 2 other people's plans. I held up the letter and gave my name. I said the date twice. I laid the photos on the table, the yellow tag on top, like a stack of cards I was willing to turn over in any light. I'm repairing what was mine to begin with, I said. You don't need my steps to make something good. The room went very quiet in that way meetings do when they bump into a fact that won't move. The company man smiled like a man checking his pockets. He asked to review documentation with staff. Miguel stepped forward, gave his full name and the name of his business, and explained the survey tape, the corner pins, the difference between a path people use and an easement that exists. He didn't flex, he measured. It landed. Afterward, in the corridor that smelled like waxed floors and old decisions, the company man lowered his voice. We can curve the line, he said at last, practical now that the microphones were off. We don't need your steps. I nodded and didn't shake his hand because I was using mine to hold the thermos. Outside, the air felt cooler and cleaner, like a room after you've opened a window that was stuck. When I got back to the cabin, the porch smelled faintly of new paint and soft wood warming after a cool day. I set the kettle to boil and spread the papers on the table to breathe. Miguel looked at them and at me the way a foreman looks at a beam that has agreed to load. You handled that, he said, with facts. We drank tea in chipped cups and sat on the new bench in a silence that felt like shelter. I thought peace would keep until morning. I was wrong. At 9 that night, my phone lit up with a message from the insurance company changing the estimate downward because a satellite photo suggested pre-existing wear. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because you can either laugh or let paper do your crying. I wrote back with photos of the flood line taken the night of the alert and copies of maintenance receipts I found in the trunk. Oil-stained slips with Harold's neat handwriting, dates clear as bells. Proof is sometimes ugly. It works anyway. For the first time since the water, I slept through. Morning carried a small pride. I made tea and wrote a list that looked like progress. Seal porch rail, clear needle traps near downspouts, county office to record letter, ask neighbor about snowplow. The kettle clicked off and I realized I wanted to share a small thing with Larissa. Nothing heavy, just the way the steam looked in the slant of light. I sent her a photo of the cup and the caption, "First morning it tasted like home." She replied with a picture of her own mug on a spotless counter. Then another message. "Can I come next Wednesday after work? Alone." I answered yes before the part of me that hoards safety could make a speech. Wednesday, the road cooperated. She arrived with a tote bag of practical gifts, batteries, a flashlight you could land a plane with, hand cream for hands that have remembered tools. We sat at the table, And for once, her questions were not an audit. "I've been seeing someone," she said suddenly, then laughed at herself. "Not like that. A counselor. She says I lead with logistics because I'm afraid of mess." She bit the inside of her cheek. "I'm sorry I made you feel like a mess." "I am a mess," I said, smiling. "I'm just not refuse." She took a breath that looked like a peel coming off a fruit. "Can we start coming up on Sundays? I can help you inventory, and you can teach me the way you mend seams that don't show." The way she said we told me she meant it. I put the kettle on again because sometimes the best answer is hot and repeatable. The man in the crisp shirt did not return. The county clerk mailed me a stamped copy of the recorded letter with a sticky note that said, "You're squared away." The insurance adjusted back upward after I sent proof, plus an email from my neighbor who had photos from the same night. I made a folder called Keep and one called Don't Try Me Again. The cabin learned our footsteps. The door stopped complaining. The porch became a place where time liked to linger. On a Saturday near dusk, Miguel arrived with a gift that looked like a chore. A broken rocking chair he'd found at a sale. Joints loose, one runner cracked clean through. "Looks like work," I said. "Looks like you," he answered, which I chose to take as the compliment it was. We set the chair on the porch and laid out sandpaper, glue, clamps. Larissa came the next morning with coffee and a notepad and wrote down the steps. "Measure twice, cut once," she said, and we all laughed because some truths are fond of cliches. The chair took the glue the way dry wood takes rain, slowly at first, then with relief. I learned to leave the porch light on exactly 10 minutes after dark and not a minute more. Long enough to welcome. Not long enough to invite moths that don't know when to quit. I learned that the creak down the slope could be heard only when I wasn't trying to. I learned that sorrow, when given work and a place to wash its hands, becomes something you can carry without spilling. When the chair was finally dry, we tested it like examiners and fools, one after the other. Gentle at first, and then with more faith. It rocked. It spoke the old language of houses that say yes without an audience. I set the kettle between us, and we drank our tea in the soft motion that makes conversations last longer than they would on flat chairs. On Sundays, Larissa began to arrive with a planner that held fewer battles and more blank squares. Sometimes she brought blueberries or clean dish towels. Sometimes she brought nothing and said that was the point. We mended curtains and lists. She told me about the appointments she and Diogo kept, the ones they canceled, the questions they weren't sure how to ask each other. I told her about Harold and the way we once fixed a sink with nothing but stubbornness and the wrong wrench. We traded stories the way other people trade recipes. One afternoon, she stood in the doorway and watched the light slide across the floorboards. "When I slammed the door that night," she said, "I thought I was drowning. It felt like choosing between you and the life I was trying to build." She swallowed. "Now I think I chose a sentence I didn't mean." I set the kettle back on the stove, unboiled. "We survived both," I said. "The water and the sentence. That has to count for something." She nodded and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand like a child who knows crying won't change curfew, but does it anyway. Miguel started showing up with smaller and smaller excuses. A loose hinge, a squeaky step, a bundle of shingles that might as well go somewhere useful. He never stayed past sunset unless there was real work to finish. When he did, he sat on the edge of the porch, hands on his knees, listening to the trees as if they were co-workers. Once he said, "You know I'm not here to rescue you." "I know," I answered. "You're here to build with me." He smiled without showing teeth, which is how men smile when they mean it. The rocking chair became our unofficial guest book. Neighbors sat in it and talked about wells, taxes, dogs, the way snowdrifts behave on that bend in the road. People brought news of the valley and left with seams mended on jackets and curtains. A widow down the lane asked if I could look at her late husband's coat. The lining had come loose where his wallet used to sit. "Grief always breaks the same stitch," I told her, and we fixed it together while the kettle hummed. I used to think the flood was the story. The daughter's door, the headline, the rest a footnote. Sitting on that porch, watching steam curl around people's hands, I began to suspect the opposite. The story was the long part after. The railings repainted, the yellow tag on the wall, the meeting where paper held, the apology that didn't make a ledger but made a path. The story was the way a key survived a tin, and a kettle survived a river, and a woman survived both and learned to call it living. If you've listened this far, tell me your city. I like to imagine the steam from this cup finding its way to your kitchen window, even for a second, and reminding you that ruin is not the opposite of home. It's the clearing where you learn how to build one. Miguel showed up one morning with a ladder and a coil of rope, and we walked the roofline together, me steadying the base while he cleared the last of the needle traps. Clouds gathered over the ridge in the color of unmade decisions. He glanced at the sky and said we'd get rain by evening. I told him I was tired of flinching at the sound of water. Then let it rain, he said, tying off the rope. We'll listen and see what needs fixing. The first drops came like a rehearsal. By dusk, the cabin was wrapped in sound. The door swelled just enough to complain when I checked the latch. The kettle sang like it always has, and we ate soup that tasted better because it steamed the windows. Larissa texted that she'd try to make it Sunday, if the roads behave. I set my phone face down and tried to believe roads could be taught manners. Near midnight, the power hiccuped and went out. The room remembered the old ways. I lit the lamp and was grateful I'd learned the 10-minute rule for moths. Wind leaned on the trees, but not hard enough to make them confess. I put on my coat and stepped onto the porch to listen. Down the slope, the creek had found a bigger voice. A light flashed on the road, then another, then a horn, quick with panic. I headed down with my flashlight and the old winter boots that liked to be useful. A sedan sat crosswise in the ditch, 2 wheels spinning in place, a young couple standing beside it, soaked and shaking but unhurt. "We're fine," the woman said, which is what frightened people say before they're sure. I called Miguel. He answered on the second ring and said he was already putting on his jacket. We worked in the rain the way people do when the problem isn't deciding but doing. A tow strap, a careful throttle, 2 deep breaths. The sedan climbed back to the road like a cow up a muddy bank. They thanked us too many times and drove away with both hands tight on the wheel. Back at the porch, water ran off the eaves in plain lines. I laid a towel on the floor and thought maybe repetition is how trust grows. Drip by drip, night by night. When the power returned, the lamp flickered and settled like a tired child. I wiped the kettle's lid with the edge of my sleeve and told myself the house and I had passed a small exam. At dawn, a truck door closed in the drive. I braced for a clipboard. It wasn't a stranger, it was Diogo. He had the look of a man who'd been volunteered. "Larissa said you lost power," he said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. Thought I'd check the lines down the road. He's good with wires and anything that pretends to be permanent. I let him in because nothing in my hand said not to. He stood in the doorway looking at the new bench, the lamps, the kettle drying on the stove. "You made this into something," he said, not quite ready to call it home. We walked the lane to where branches had bowed the line. He cleared what he could and flagged what he couldn't for the county. On the way back, he kicked a stone with the kind of frustration that looks for a smaller object. "I was wrong about the meeting," he said finally. "About the line. It's not just maps." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't not one. I poured him coffee and we stood in the pause that comes before naming things. He picked up the folded flyer peeking out from under the kettle. "You going to their follow-up?" he asked. "If they drag that dotted line again," I said. He put it back exactly where he'd found it, as if careful placement could count as respect. He left with a promise to fix the downed section when the county gave the all clear. I watched the ridge swallow his taillights and felt the day tilt towards something less brittle. Then the mail carrier's SUV rattled up the lane and left me a certified envelope with a seal I didn't like. Inside, a notice gave me 30 days to cure title irregularities or face possible action. My hands went cold. The words weren't loud, but they carried the same weight as emergency alert. The letter might as well have been a stone dropped in a bucket. It hit, and the water remembered how to move. I took the envelope to Miguel and laid it on the tailgate next to his measuring tape. He read it twice and didn't perform outrage. "It's a notice, not a verdict," he said. The county clerk's name sat near the bottom like a door you could knock on. We drove into town with the blue kettle wrapped in a towel on the seat between us, because I wanted something I trusted in the truck. The clerk had a streak of blue in her hair, and the kind of patience you wish on people with gavel jobs. She pulled up records and tapped through screens that stacked decades like firewood. "The chain is messy," she said, "but not broken. You need an affidavit of occupancy, a quiet title petition, and a surveyor's letter saying your neighbors don't argue the boundaries." She slid a form toward me. "This is a list, not a cliff." Air came back into my lungs in pieces. "You can do this," she added. And I believed her because she sounded bored by drama and loyal to facts. That afternoon, I posted a note at the feed store asking for a surveyor who knew the ridge and didn't mind bad coffee. A man named Harris circled the number with a fingernail and called before sunset. His voice sounded like tire tread. "I'll be there Tuesday before the shade leaves your porch," he said. Meanwhile, I did what I could do in a day. I wrote the affidavit in my own hand because that's how my mother taught me to talk to paper. I printed photos of the porch with the date in the corner. I found 2 neighbors willing to sign that I live where I say I do, and that I'm not the kind to invent a roof. At night, when my brain wanted to rehearse disasters, I gave it chores. Hemmed a neighbor's work pants for the price of a bag of screws, patched a quilt square that had been waiting since before Larissa learned to read. The kettle sounded like agreement each time it clicked off. On Tuesday, Harris walked the lines with a compass that looked older than his hat. He found corner pins under duff-like coins, flagged a curve I'd never noticed, and drew a map that matched the land, not the brochure. "You're fine," he said. "You're just not neat." He left me with a stamped letter that called the edges true. For the first time since the envelope, sleep felt like a place you arrive at, not a thing that ambushes you. I brought the affidavit, the photos, and Harris's letter to a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and cheap coffee. The judge wore readers low on his nose and looked over them the way teachers do when they hope you studied. On one side sat a woman from the development company who looked like she chewed ice. On the other, an empty chair labeled for "any interested heir," which is a phrase that can ruin holidays. The judge asked straightforward questions. I answered with sentences that did not wobble. The company's lawyer tried to make the parcel sound like the corner of a bigger thought. She spoke of regional connectivity and maximized recreational assets, like my porch were a spare tire on someone else's SUV. The judge tapped Harris's letter with his pen. "Lines are lines," he said. Then he looked at the empty heir's chair and back at me. "Anyone else wish to be heard?" From the back row, Larissa stood. I hadn't known she'd slipped in. "May I speak as family?" she asked. He nodded. She walked to the front like a woman carrying something she didn't plan to drop. She didn't perform shame or sugar. She said I had been living there, repairing what existed. She said the parcel was not a shortcut. It was a home. She admitted, in the polite language courts prefer, that the night of the flood she had chosen fear and exhaustion over kindness, and that she was trying to fix that. Her voice did not tremble, which felt like a gift I could never have demanded. The judge sighed the way men who read paper all day sigh when they finally find an answer. "Quiet title granted, pending filing," he said. "Easement denied. Curved trail acceptable if posted and maintained at the company's expense." The gavel tapped like an efficient handshake. The lawyer with the ice chewer face gathered her files without huffing. Defeat looked almost decent on her. Outside, in the sunlight that smelled faintly of exhaust and pine, Larissa hugged me with both arms, no clipboard between us. "I won't let anyone call your steps underutilized again," she said. I believed her. On the way to the truck, we passed the company man from the first meeting. He gave me a nod that looked like a concession with his pride still intact. "We'll redraw," he said. "We'll keep off your porch." The road home felt shorter. The porch felt taller. I put the kettle on and watched the steam curl into a day that had decided to be kind. I thought we had finally turned the corner, but houses and hearts keep their own ledgers. That night, Larissa called to say she was late for dinner. Her voice had the thin edge it gets when there's a conversation she isn't having at her own table. The next evening, she drove up alone, a paper bag on the passenger seat, and something folded inside her mouth. We sat at the table and let the silence make room. "I was cruel at the door because I was drowning," she said at last, and the word fit between us like a key in an old lock. Trying to get pregnant, failing, counting pills, counting days, hating how I counted. Diogo thinks the world is a set of problems that yield to systems. I wanted one night that wasn't a problem to solve. She stared at her hands. "Then your flood arrived and I treated you like a system. I am sorry." My throat tightened and then loosened, like a knot deciding its job was finished. "I'm sorry I taught you to lead with logistics," I said. "It's how I survived. I forgot to teach you the other half, to leave a chair pulled out just in case." She laughed without meanness. "You're better at metaphors than I am." "No," I said. "I'm just better at kettles." We walked the path to the creek and let the water talk first. "I don't want to be in the middle between you and him," she said. "You won't be," I answered. "You're not a bridge. You're a person." She nodded in that slow way that means a thought has finally found a shelf. "Can we come on Sundays anyway?" she asked. "Even if we don't know what we're doing with anything else?" "Yes," I said. "Bring your notepad." "I'll bring the seam ripper." On the way back, she touched the porch post the way you touch a shoulder you are getting to know again. She left before dark because she likes the edges of the day to be clear. When the silence settled, it was a good one, like a room holding air after laughter. An hour later, Miguel arrived with something that looked like a plan and smelled like cut wood. He'd drawn a list for a small shed out back, tools, a bench, a place to put what doesn't belong in the kitchen. "You don't have to live out of a trunk anymore," he said. We measured the footprint together under a sky that had decided to trust us. At the last stake, he hesitated as if searching for a different measurement. "You know I'm not here to rescue you," he said. "I know," I answered. "You're here to build with me." He smiled without showing teeth. "Good," he said. "Rescuing is heavy. Building fits better in my hands." We set the first post the next morning. It stood like it had chosen the job. By the time the shed had walls, the cabin had rhythms. Monday was phone calls, Tuesday was errands, Wednesday belonged to the porch, Thursday to mending, Friday to anything that had fallen off the list. The kettle became both metronome and reward. I wrote a hand-lettered sign and set it at the end of the lane on Saturdays. Seam and steam. Mending while you wait, tea on the porch. People came with jeans and curtains and the kinds of stories that only spill when hands are busy. Some paid in cash. Some paid in apples, nails, or a promise to show up at the next county meeting. The porch learned the weight of other people's elbows. One afternoon, Diogo arrived with a rolled blueprint and a peace offering I hadn't known I wanted. A dozen clothespins and a length of clothesline already threaded through 2 eye hooks. "Parking layout," he said, unrolling the paper with care. "For the trailhead they insist on. It curves around your lane. 2 spaces only. A sign that says no through access. I'll make sure the sign faces the right way." He glanced at the kettle. "Tea?" he asked, awkward but trying. We stood on the porch like colleagues learning the same language. "I made it hard for her," he said, eyes on the ink. "I made it hard for you." "Sometimes systems can be softer," I said. He nodded, as if softness were a new tool he planned to try on a weekend. The insurance finally settled for enough to pay down what I owed and buy a mattress that didn't remember strangers. The county stamped my quiet title and mailed the papers back with a note from the clerk. "Nice job." I put that letter in the folder marked Keep and slid the certified envelope into the one called Don't Try Me Again. On Sunday, Larissa came with a bag of herbs and a question she asked without decorating. "Do you like him?" It took a second to find the right him. "Miguel?" She nodded. "I like building with him," I said. "If I like more than that, I'll tell you after I tell myself." She laughed, the sound of a woman who has stopped putting everyone on trial. We planted basil in a tin that once held cookies and now earned its place by making the porch smell like July. In the evening, the rocking chair took me back and forth in a private language. I thought the hard part had finished asking for attention. Then the phone rang. The development company had redrawn the map and wanted signatures to finalize. "We're offering a small stipend for cooperation," the woman said, voice smooth as a coaster sliding under a glass. "You can keep your porch. We just need a corner of your lower lot for drainage." I closed my eyes and saw the creek in a storm, the water searching for the easiest path like grief with a shovel. "No," I said. "Curve elsewhere." She inhaled sharply and exhaled customer service. "We'll adjust." When I hung up, I realized my voice hadn't needed backup. The shed finished on a day that tasted like sawdust and relief. Miguel hung a pegboard and labeled the hooks with a carpenter's handwriting. We slid Harold's old toolbox onto a shelf. The metal squeak sounded like a man satisfied after a long drive. Miguel ran his palm along the bench he'd planned himself. "You could teach a class here," he said. "Mending, chair glue, how to talk to paper." The idea flashed through me like a bird you hear before you see. A class would bring people who wanted to learn repair, not just buy it. It would give the porch a job even in winter. "We'll try," I said, and the words felt like a key I hadn't known I carried. We made simple flyers at the library. Mend and make do. Bring something torn, leave with it whole. Tea provided. I taped them where people wait. The laundromat, the post office, the clinic that replaces knees. The first Saturday, 3 women and a teenager showed up with a coat lining, a backpack seam, and a chair that had forgotten its courage. We worked and we talked and the kettle sang. When someone asked how much, I said, "Pay what it's worth to you and what you can." They brought money, cinnamon rolls, and an offer from a man who knew gutters. Community is a currency that spends in more directions than cash. Larissa began to arrive on Sundays with a planner that held fewer battles and more lists labeled later. Once she cried without apology and said she didn't know what would happen in the chapter about babies. I poured tea and told her the truth I'd earned the slow way. We are not less ourselves when plans change shape. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she did when she was 6 and afraid of thunder. The next week, Diogo came with 2 folding chairs and a joke that admitted he'd been careful when it wasn't required. "I can learn," he said. "Everyone says that. The difference is the ones who do." He stayed to help fix a neighbor's leaky gutter and left with a bag of basil and a copy of the flyer. That counted. Miguel and I took the rocking chair into town for a small market and put a tag on it that said, "Not for sale. Please sit." People did. Some swung their feet and told stories about houses that aren't there anymore. Some closed their eyes for a minute because the motion borrowed a calmer hour and brought it back. A woman asked if I could fix her mother's chair the same way. I said yes, and felt my voice find a fuller room. Summer gathered around us like a plain but faithful shawl. The trailhead opened with 2 spaces and a sign that faced the right way. The dotted line on the new map curved away from my steps and found a polite route through scrub that didn't mind attention. The company man showed up at the ribbon cutting with a grin and a sentence I appreciated more than I expected. "Thanks for making this better." The county clerk came and brought cookies because some people act like neighbors even when they wear badges. Harris the surveyor nodded once like a man whose lines held. The judge jogged past in shorts and waved without remembering why he knew me. We laughed, ate cookies, and then I went home to my porch and set the kettle to boil for whoever would arrive at dusk. When the kettle clicked, Larissa texted a picture, a negative test beside a mug with the caption, "We'll try again when we want to." There was no panic in the sentence. I put the phone down and let the relief be small and sufficient. In early fall, I recorded the quiet title at the county, paid the taxes that were due, and slipped the stamped receipt into the folder with the tidy satisfaction that glows without showing off. The insurance company sent a final check with an apology printed by a machine. I deposited it and bought a secondhand cast iron kettle for the wood stove, the kind that puffs when it's pleased. Miguel found a storm door that almost fit and made up the difference with 2 new screws and a little persuasion. We planted garlic in a row so straight even my mother would have nodded. Larissa started coming on Wednesdays just to sit. Once she brought a book and didn't open it. Once she brought nothing and said that was the point. One evening, she asked if I missed my old house. "I miss the groove on the porch where I dragged the chair every spring," I said. "I miss the spot in the yard where the tomatoes believed they could be better than last year. I don't miss paying for a story that ended." She nodded like she was taking notes she could use later. Diogo arrived with a bundle of kindling and the wariness of a man with a reputation to change. He sat in the not-for-sale chair and didn't ask what it cost to be forgiven. His eyes softened when the kettle sang. "This sounds like a house," he said. "It is," I answered, and realized I finally believed it all the way through. On the first truly cold morning, the iron kettle breathed like a small animal. The windows sketched their own weather on the inside, a lace you could wipe away with your sleeve. I learned the angle of my hands for lighting the stove without scaring the match. The coat from the wardrobe box still remembered my shoulders. People kept coming up the lane with things to mend and news to trade. They left with seams that held and tea that still had a little argument left in it. I started to sleep the way cabins prefer, early and honest, with one window cracked just enough to let the pine in. A letter arrived from the company that made the blue kettle, offering a discount for loyalty. I laughed and slid it under the iron one like a truce. The original kettle stayed on the shelf over the stove, enamel nicked, handle polished by years of being needed. I don't keep it there because I worship objects. I keep it there because it stayed itself when the river tried to teach me otherwise. The green tin sits beside it, empty for the first time in 50 years. The brass key hangs in a cheap shadow box that looks expensive only because of what it holds. When people ask, I tell them it's not luck. It's stubbornness with a sense of humor. On a Sunday that wore its light just right, Larissa came early with muffins and the particular smile she saves for sentences she isn't afraid of. "We're not trying for a while," she said, dropping the apology that wanted to ride along. "We're going to be married people who like each other on purpose." I poured tea and said I was glad. She looked around the porch and said, "This place made me want that." Miguel arrived with a small sign carved from cedar. "The steam house." I protested and then hung it straight. Neighbors laughed and said it fit. Winter came anyway, as it does. Snow made the trailhead quiet and the porch creak under a new kind of weight. We put a rug by the door, a box of spare gloves under the bench, and a rule on the wall in my mother's words: "Wipe your feet, but bring your story in." The iron kettle puffed. The blue one watched. The shed kept the tools in order. The rocking chair understood the speed our conversations needed. When the plow shoved a ridge of snow across the lane, someone texted before I had time to worry. A card arrived from the development company with a photograph of the curved trail under frost and a handwritten line. "Thanks for the curve." I stuck it to the fridge as proof that sometimes even paper can learn its manners. I used to think survival was the end of a story, the part where the camera fades and the credits roll. Now I know it's the beginning people forget to film. Survival is the part where you choose which bills get paid and which boxes stay packed. It's the part where you hang a line for other people's laundry and put a kettle on for whoever is brave enough to admit something broke. It's the part where you learn to say no without a paragraph of apology leaking out behind it. Most mornings I wake before the alarm I don't set anymore. I pull on the coat that remembers me and walk the small perimeter of what's mine. Porch, path, shed, the bend in the lane where the map used to lie. I listen for new noises and old problems. I check the hinge, the lock, the crack in the step we keep meaning to fix on a day that isn't beautiful. Then I go inside and choose which kettle fits the weather. Some mornings I use the blue enamel because it's good to remind my hands who they were before the water came. Some mornings I use the iron because winter respects weight. I stand in the doorway while the steam finds the glass and say thank you in a voice too soft to require an answer. People still arrive with things torn and hopes of leaving whole. A ripped sleeve, a split chair rung, a story about a son who doesn't call, a husband who drank the savings. We sit, we mend what can be mended, and we name what can't. I tell them what the flood in the cabin and the bruising words at a daughter's door taught me. You are more than the worst night someone handed you. If you stayed with me to the end, tell me your city. I like to imagine the steam from this house lifting just enough to brush your window, even for a second, and whisper that ruin is not the opposite of home. Ruin is only the clearing. Home is what you decide to build there, board by stubborn board, cup by stubborn cup, until the place that almost ended you starts saying your name back.